I don't know about you, but I'm exhausted after that. Fucking hell.
You have been doing this for 10 years, man.
Hold on. You've never interviewed a man like Sir Martin Sorrell, or aka Sir Marty. He wouldn't even let me call him Sir Marty. I was really disappointed about that. Anyway, so we're here to talk about ad tech. Back to some ground I'm comfortable on. Holding groups. Who knows about holding groups? Agencies. Anyway, we're here to talk about the future of the ad-funded model, right? So this has been a bit of a tumultuous year for the cookie. Our third-party cookies effectively been the framework for our entire industry over the last 15 years. We've now been told by Apple that third-party cookies are evil. You can't do any tracking with them, even with they were using sort of a workaround with was it tinkering? What can't remember the name. Anyway, it's some way of tracking to the click to conversion. They can't even do that now. Mozilla's come out this week to say no more third-party cookie use. I mean, if you actually look at Mozilla incognito, you probably have already done this. It completely blocks third-party cookies, including DFP. Look at the Guardian on Mozilla. It literally is ad-free. So this is obviously going to prove a massive issue for the entire industry. So Andrew, are we in the last throes of the cookie economy? Is this the end?
It might be time to think about tomatoes as an alternative to cookies. We need a different thing to eat. Look, this obviously breaks a lot of the underlying assumptions that underpin at least programmatic, because every transaction, for the most part, either has a cookie-based identifier or a mobile-based identifier that is used to append any form of targeting or segmentation data. We have an active lesson that I think people neglect to look at a lot, which is Safari and Safari usage and the value of impressions from Safari. It's incredibly low, and it's an active testimonial that hasn't been around for just a year or two when the war with ITP started, but has been really an ineffective means of monetization for the better part of the decade. The concern, I would say, is the belief that media has to be bought by marketers, and so if you lose the cookie and you lose addressability, it'll still be bought because it has to. And I think the realization we have to make is that addressability, and particularly identity-first addressability, performs incredibly well. It's why Facebook was able to transform social media, which was content that was never bought before, into some of the most valuable media in the world, because it works so well when you take a marketer who's increasingly going direct-to-consumer, first-party, and append that to media. So I would look at this as existential, not just for the ad tech economy, but really for the broader web. That said, we also see a tremendous amount of opportunity in trying to solve this. And we think that there will be a small number of winners and potentially many losers. We think the solve has to do with an authenticated environment, or an environment of trust between the consumer and the media company or the publisher. We don't think many will qualify for that kind of an arrangement. But we think those that do will be the seed for what tomorrow's version of addressability looks like without the cookie.
So let's just talk about the publisher, right? Because on the marketer, right? So we think about programmatic and cookie syncing, right? And that's no longer possible on an Apple framework, an ITP first framework. Chrome have given a stay of execution to us, but this is quite serious, because the fundamentals of DR marketing, if you will, never mind brand, even brand for that matter, around frequency capping, the ability to measure, the ability to build into your attribution model, the ability to do targeting, all kind of goes away with sort of the cookie at the minute, right? Because that's the way we do things. The publisher is going to hurt pretty hard if this becomes, across all browsers, not just basically Safari. Because Safari have, I don't know what their market share in the browser area is in the UK. I think it's around 30-40% if you include mobile. And obviously Chrome is 50-60%, which is still a lot. And I think a lot of the marketers that I've been talking to, a lot of the buyers are shoving a lot of the demand, the programmatic demand, into Chrome. So the ECPMs on Safari are definitely dropping. I've seen it myself versus Chrome. So what can the publishers do? Because it's a big jump. Like, we're about to leave the cookie economy, we're going to a first party economy, right? So how does a publisher sort of prepare themselves for that? Because we talked about this before. What do? They force logins? Do they force people to collect first-party data. I came up with an idea there last week called the shit web. Did you hear about this?
I have not heard about it.
It's really, really cool, actually. So the idea is that you'd anybody coming to Safari, right? You just force them into a shitty version of the web from 1988, right? With about 70 different contextual ads, pop-up ads, and absolute crap UI. And then there's a link at the back saying, if you want an upgrade, please consent. Yeah. And say, we can't afford to keep the lights on. You freeload them.
Right. Hey, I like to kind of talk about a few of those things, so I'll unpack them a little bit. The first is just the boring stuff. When people talk about cookies and identity, they usually just quickly go to targeting as the why, and undoubtedly that is a huge component. But they neglect the boring stuff that you mentioned. We rag on cookies a lot, but they were pretty good at frequency capping globally. They were decently good at conversion and attribution. All that goes out the window too. And so now we have a media form that you can't do any of those very, very primitive basic things with, in addition to the fact that it lacks addressability. That becomes a huge problem. That brings to bear the word inefficiency. And so the Safari trend that you're witnessing is active and happening. Safari media is inefficient, so it is seeing less budget year over year. If that becomes the web on the whole, that's not a very good story for anybody. What could happen in the near term before the long term? I would say the near term, and we're having conversations like this with a lot of publishers, there is a very, very soft parallel that you could make between the Safari audience and an ad-blocked audience, whereby if you look at ad-blocked audiences today, for the most part, most publishers are engaging with them to some degree, at least in a very soft capacity of saying, let's have a conversation about what you've installed because it is impacting our ability to have any kind of economics to fund this content. Well, when you're using a browser with any form of inferior addressability, we might start to see a very similar trend whereby the publishers could engage with the consumer to say, could you switch to a browser that we can actually generate revenue on? It is possible. We have seen this before on the web. There were browser wars before where we had publishers speaking to the consumer saying, switch away from IE because you cannot render this website correctly with the browser you're using today. There's a possibility a swing back could occur if things get tight enough. On the other hand, the other possibility is in another year we go from Chrome, which is appearing to be a safe haven at the moment for any form of third-party cookies, to a tomorrow state where that could still change too, and then there are no safe havens. That's another possibility.
So then, you in your presentation at your conference there a couple months ago, you talk about the authenticated web versus the anonymous web, right? I want to talk about that a little bit, right? So this is going back to the sort of many different sort of actions by publishers, particularly Germany and Portugal, who are doing single sign-ons, right? The ability to have logged-in users, which is what gives Facebook and Google their power, that login, email, that sort of that hash. Do you think the publishers need to kind of have that conversation and sort of, I don't say force, because that's not the word, because in the GDPR world you can't force users to consent or to log in, but you can certainly make it more attractive.
Yeah, we're recommending to anyone that we talk to at least start in the softest form of that. And the softest form of that is to organize assets publishers already have. While the majority of publishers that are not named Google or Facebook certainly do not have authenticated audiences, some percentage of their audiences today do have some form of authentication, whether it's through commenting systems or forums, whether it's through newsletters, and whether it's through the extreme of a full login. There is some form of that today across many pubs. That data is not organized at all. Internally, the politics around accessing that identifier are very complex. Start there so that wherever tomorrow goes, you're at least on the road, so that if you do need to contemplate a more friction-based interaction with the user to get that authentication event, you've at least started instead of having to do it all at the last minute. GDPR is an example of what happens when everything happens at the last minute. It doesn't go well. So the sooner you start, the better.
And do you think that the authenticated web will yield higher CPM? So if you think about, let's think about two parts. The authenticated web is a login web, is I know who you are, right? Anonymously, obviously. But I'm able to target and do all the things. Do you think the CPMs are going to rise for those publishers who can have users in that state?
Well, I'd say we're beyond, just wishful thinking. When Sir Martin was on stage, he was talking about one of the data assets that impressed him, which is Merkle. We've been working an awful lot with Merkle over the last 2.5 years to bring their graph to bear in programmatic. And when those buying events occur, the CPMs are pretty good. Certainly well above the programmatic average. And that's largely because they're fully addressable, they're people-based, and they're tied to a marketer's first-party graph. So we see early signs with actionable revenue that is true. We're also seeing the same today, also in the U.S. With Roundel by Target, which is something that we announced this summer, where Target's using its big retail graph to do very similar addressable media. CPMs there are pretty comfortable as well. The challenge is we literally have to recreate every single media event in an entirely new way. Doing that quickly is not trivial. So
What do you mean by that?
Well, if you imagine the majority of programmatic revenue today, at least on the web, comes from a cookie, if tomorrow it has to come from a graph by way of addressability, that means a pretty massive reset that you're not going to be able to do overnight. So wherever we can, we are trying to push the market towards this before the inevitability, but it will take time.
What happens to the anonymous web? Like the dark web, obviously not the dark web, that's a totally different thing. Let's not talk about that today. But the anonymous web, as you put it, what happens? Is it just, shit in the wall, contextual, throw as much as you can, might work, might not work? I have no idea.
Yeah, it's gonna look an awful lot like the web 15, 20 years ago. I think if we ever get to a state where Chrome makes one additional change, and I think that additional change will come by way of the consumer. If you kind of think about what they announced at Google I/O in May, ad tech collectively just breathed for a second because it was a fairly innocuous request, which was if you are going to use cross-site tracking or third-party cookies, all Chrome is requiring you to do in ad tech or any kind of other arena is to declare your intention to do so. So declare your intention to cross-site track, and you're good with Chrome. That was pretty safe, pretty easy. But if you think of what could happen next or what could come next, everyone that is now declared could get categorized. And so if you think of the use cases that I think Chrome very correctly is trying to protect, those use cases could fall into different categories. On one hand, you could have advertising. On the other hand, you could have e-commerce, and then you could have certainly a few other buckets. Those use cases could then go to the consumer, and they could represent in the form of a choice. And the consumer could start checking boxes and effectively controlling our ability to do that too. So there is potentially far more to come from Chrome with time. We have no idea what the plan is beyond the fairly innocuous declare your intent, which is all they've done so far.
So you'd rather not be dependent on Google effectively as the gatekeeper for our entire industry, because it does feel like we're kind of hanging on there, really, aren't we? Like Google really could flick the switch. But I don't think they will.
I don't think they will. I don't think they'll do anything unless they're pressured to. But what I'm saying is, if they are pressured to, I don't think they'll take the Apple tact. I think they'll make it a consumer control.
I think they might be forced to sell Chrome, actually.
Who's going to buy it?
I will. And I'll make it. We can always use third-party cookies forever. In a recent sort of Trader Talk TV, your vice president of product management, Mike O'Sullivan, he was talking about sort of this sonar product you're coming out with. I'm intrigued by that because I always feel that Index are kind of like one step ahead of the oncoming sort of truck. You know what I mean? You're one of those companies that go, oh, there's a truck. I better go to the left or the right. It won't hit me.
Yeah, we do like to stick around.
In a good way.
Yeah, in a good way. A lot of our investments in identity started in 2017. In 2018, we announced Merkle, and this year we announced Roundel by Target. If you go back to 2017, the idea always was, how do we decouple our dependency on the cookie? It's taken us quite a few years to reimagine some of the underlying plumbing, but most of that's well underway. What we announced with Sonar, which is going into beta with clients probably in the next month or so, is this idea that where you have some form of authentication today as a publisher, so kind of that low percentage but starting base, whether it's, again, a commenting system, newsletters, forum, what have you, and we have an audience that has no addressability, so obviously Safari, in place of a cookie, we can now integrate into that authentication point and use that in a bid request to a DSP in place of a cookie. So imagine you have a Safari user today who has no third-party cookie availability, but is actively engaged with this publisher in some form of commenting system, let's say. The publisher knows who that individual is. The hash of that user's email address can turn into an anonymous ID, back to index, back to buyers, and we can use that to tie into graphs. So we can use that now to tie into the Merkle M1 graph, for instance. And now fully addressable media can work with an audience that had absolutely no form of addressability. That's the Sonar product.
Is that scalable? I mean, you say at the minute that hasn't kind of been rolled out across the ecosystem. Is that a scalable proposition to sort of, to help marketers and publishers?
I certainly hope so. If it isn't, I don't see a lot of hope for addressability without a cookie. I think we're in a pretty good spot, largely because a lot of publishers that we work with today, we work with through one of our library products where we have code on page with the publisher, which gives us the opportunity to do a lot of the heavy lifting of integrations without the need for their teams to get involved. So we can, I think, compress time to market, which is critical, but ultimately it's still going to take time to reset the pub side and then also get more buyers buying based on first-party graphs instead of based on cookie ID lists.
You can make an argument over the last, say, 10 years, eCPMs, there's been downward pressure on them. Like they've kind of increased, but not by an awful lot. Does this mean that those premium publishers that have all the quality content, right? We're not talking about the mid to long tail, but the bigger publishers. Are they now an opportunity to really? This could be a golden era for them in many ways because they've done all right out of programmatic, but you could argue that it's eaten into their bigger I/O business and they've taken a hit, and a lot of the money. You hear buyers say we buy around those guys. We don't need them. We don't need their context. We'll buy around them. But now you can't really buy around them because the ability to do retargeting across browsers, and we're not including Chrome there, but some browsers is going to be harder and harder. So that ability for premium publishers to have the relationship with their users is going to become even more valuable. And is there a sense that they're going to make more money over the next sort of 10 years?
We look at it as a different budget. So, I'll use the Merkle example one more time. We see a lot of the budgets that are moving into programmatic now for the first time coming from Facebook. If you think of the direct-to-consumer marketer or the marketer with a lot of first-party data, they have customer lists. They have CRM files that turn into hashes of email addresses. Facebook has, within 5 or 6 clicks, made it incredibly easy to use the custom audiences product to buy those users on Facebook. They get a disproportionate amount of those budgets, which are completely dark today to any kind of direct I/O buy, and are, for the most part, dark today in programmatic. We want to capture that budget and bring it to our customers, bring it to our publishers, which is a huge opportunity over and above what we see today. So the answer to your question is absolutely yes, because for the most part, those budgets go almost exclusively to a Facebook or a Google.
And the publisher has to have that strong user relationship. That's important. That's even more important now in this new era as well.
100%. That's the key.
Yeah. Where do you see where do you see marketers fit into this as well? I mean, there's a bunch of marketers who've depended on this type of on the ecosystem, the cookie ecosystem to do their thing. How are they going to work in this new ecosystem? Are they going to have to, are the relationships between them and the publishers going to get tighter effectively? And where do you see that going?
The relationships might. I think one of the things to also understand is that this doesn't require a great sharing event for this to be successful. So like the kind of the thing that broke the dream of third-party cookie being super accurate or second-party data potentially being scaled was this belief that you have to pool your data together. Nobody wants to do that because everybody wants to keep what they know separate. When you think of first-party buying based on identity, you don't actually end up leaking what you know to the other side because the ultimate addressable attribute, the email address, is generally hashed and securely encrypted. It's a point of transaction. That's not really leaking into another graph. It's just something to be aware of. What I would say the marketer will have to do, though, is kind of rethink everything in a way. Because if you think of the way targeting works today largely because you're picking up a passive user behavior and putting it into a segment. They went to our website, we're going to remarket this user. They went to a car site, we think that they're in market to buy an automotive. That's kind of how today works. Tomorrow it doesn't work like that. Tomorrow it works by saying, we know this about this end user in our CRM database, or we have connected this individual to an external database and we now know that they're coming off a lease from another automotive vehicle, therefore they are now in market automotive intender. So you kind of have to rethink the way you get to the end target. And then on the attribution side, it's totally different. You're thinking about sales data connected to these files too. So the end sale is tied to a user with an identity who then can get crossed back to the media transaction. The media can be connected to identity because the log files or the end log files can also have these identifiers in them. It is totally different for the marketer, unfortunately, but it is incredibly accurate. And I think that's why so many of them are pushing in this direction. Most of the designs for identity and the ideas and frankly the push has come from the buy side. And that's a little bit reverse intuitive for a company like ours who focuses on the publisher. We are not a buy-side company. We are here for our publishers. We're here to enrich the value of their media transactions. But marketers are really pushing this agenda on us because they also want these alternatives.
Andrew, on that note, thank you very much. Andrew's around all day to talk about Sonar and the future of the cookie. He's going to be a little hub there in the corner, giving free advice to all the people who are depressed about the demise of our industry. Joke. We're in great shape. Round of applause for Andrew, please.
Thank you.